This is Gemara and Shekalim Daf Yomi as we enter the final 4 days of this fabulous Masechta of Shekalim. All the learning for this month of Nisan has been sponsored by the Grun family, Lili Nishmas Chaim Mordechai ben Naftali Tzvi, whose yahrzeit actually is today Chav Zayin Nisan Yotes of Shekalim. The Neshama is having a tremendous Lili Nishmasai. Tremendous aliyah from all the learning of the entire Chabura, as we mentioned yesterday. Baruch Hashem, the Chabura has pulled together, even during this difficult Masechta of Shekalim, still a few hundred together with us. And I also mentioned that whoever would like, it's also available on Kol Alashon as well nowadays. But again, all the learning should be a tremendous chos for Chaim Mordechai ben Naftali Tzvi. Of course, our Chayim man v'vei Chaim B'Sal Shalom Sibir Reizei Luzar Bas Genenzel Sir Bas Ita Bas Ian Bas Chaya Seir Yisrael Ben Menzel Shal Bas Chaya Eliezer Perzin Diz Javleya Shalom Bas No Ami Bas Shavegir Shir Chana Valdovani Tariv Shmo Ben Til Neil Ben Chan Reizim L'Chai Bas Vina L'Bracha B'Sal Ben Musa Dinil Bas Vina Menzel Simchot Hevia Ben Avigal Feshes Vi Ben Fegel Dvar Michal Sivin Natil Yuv Ben Nachmenda Ben Taiba B'Soy Shar Chali Yisrael as well as Chos Shidach Fatalia Bas Ita Eam Menachem Mendel Ben Elisheva. We pick it up on the very bottom of Yurches Amid Beis. We just finished discussing the 6 boxes that were there for the different nedavais. We learned a bunch of different pshatim. What does the number 6 correspond to? But the avais, different types of behemoths, different types of karbanos. And now we continue, says the Gemara Ksiv, it says in a pasuk, with regard to the nedava, and when they finished building and refurnishing the Beis HaMikdash, they brought all the nedavos in front of the king and in front of Yehoyada. Says the Gemara, they had a machlekes exactly how did Yehoyada set up the different donation boxes in the Beis HaMikdash. Rav Shimon bar Nachman Shem Rav Yonis and Amar Shteina Davos. Also, he made 2 boxes for donations. As we move along to Daf Yomi, today's Daf, Tani Dvei Rabbi Yishmael, we learned in Yeshiva Rishon Dava Achas. No, he made 1 box. The Chsev, as the pasuk says, V'yemer HaMelech V'yasa Aroin Echad, and he made 1 box. V'yitineu Beichal Beis Hashem, and he put in the Eichel in the house of God. V'yikoi V'char Bedaltai, and he made a whole Bedaltai in the lid in order to put in the money. So we have a machlekes. How many boxes did Yehoyada make for Nedavos for donations? 1 or 2? Says the Gemara, according to the Bandamar, you just told me you made 1. It says in the Torah, 3 lines in the top, Yotes. The Amar HaMelech v'yasu aroin echad v'yitineu b'shar Beis Hashem chutza. And they said they should make 1 box. Says the Gemara, that it says in the pasuk that the king said, so what's the question? The question here it's saying that it's outside the Beis HaMikdash. Previously, 2 lines from the top, it said, Behechal Beis Hashem. What does it sound like? It sounds like there were 2 boxes. 1 box was Behechal, and 1 box was Chutza. Says the Gemara, Amrav Chunav, and they had Tameim. No. Really, it was the same box? The same box was moved from inside to outside for the Tameim, for those who were impure and could not enter into the Beis HaMikdash. Going back to the first shot of Raya, that there were 2 boxes al shem, that the pasuk says that they did not make lo yaseh with the money. They did not make silver musical instruments and basins. So we see that 1 box was used for the Bedek Habayis. That's what we see in this pasuk. And the other pasukim, we saw that it was used to make the kelim. So obviously there were 2 boxes. That's the machlekes. How many boxes Yehoyada made? Hadron, Halach, Perek, Yud Gimel, Shayfrais. We should do a fabulous chazara of this 6th parak of Shekalim. Now we enter into the second last parak, and Baruch Hashem, it's gotten a little bit easier. And let's forge forward. Says the Mishnah, says the Gemara. We just spoke about it, the previous Mishnah, in the previous parak, which I'm sure everyone's also picking up on the uniqueness that in Yerushalmi, very often the different parakim flow one into another, which we did not find that way so much at Bavli. It says the Gemara, you had these 13 boxes. Now, how they were set up, we're going to see in a bit. I'll have a picture which is going to answer some questions. But at the moment, we just know there were 13 boxes. And let's say you find money between 2 boxes. You know, sometimes this is a big nafkaminas la halacha. You have 2 pushkas and you don't know which one it came from. We'll see a little bit about that today. So says the Mishnah, if you find money between Shekalim and Nedavos, two different boxes, Kariv l'Shekalim, if it's closer to Shekalim, Yiblu l'Shekalim, L'Nedava, Yiblu Nedava. That's going to be the one general rule. Wherever it's closer to, it goes to. But what happens, Mechsa, smack in the middle, Yiblu Nedava, it goes for Nedava, and if the rule is going to be, as the Mishnah is going to speak out at the end of the Mishnah, that whenever we have a Safek, it's going to go for the more Chum or the more stringent usage. And Nedava is a more stringent usage than Shekalim, as we'll see in the Gemara, because the davais were used for karbana oilis, whereas the shkalim at times can be used for bedik habayis, which we're going to see in the Gemara. Bein eitim le'levaina, between those two boxes, karv le'eitim yiblu le'eitim, le'levaina yiblu le'levaina, mechsa yiblu le'levaina, because again the le'vaina was more chamer than the eitim, because le'vaina was an actual carbon. Bein kinim le'gaizle, if it's between the birds and the gaizle oila, so karv le'kinim yiblu le'kinim, karv le'gaizle oila, yiblu le'gaizle oila. Mechsa, what happens if it's 50-50? Then Yiblu the Gaizle Ayla were more Chomer than the Kinim. The reason being that we honed in on yesterday when we said, remember the sheet of the Chachamim by the Kinim, that they held that the Kinim had part of them going as a Chatos. And the Chatos was a carbon that was eaten by the Bailim, by the Kohanim. And therefore is a lower level Kedusha than an Ayla. So if we have Kinim and we have Ayla, it's going to go for Ayla. Bein Chulin L'Maiser Sheni, then of course, Karv L'Chulin, Yiblu Chulin L'Maiser Sheni, L'Maiser Sheni, Mechsa, everyone understands this one. Yiblu L'Maiser Sheni, of course. Zeh Klal, says the Mishnah. Holchein Achara Karoiv, goes whatever's closer. Number one rule. Lahakel, even if it's as a kula. Mechsa lahachmir, as we pointed out in the beginning of the Mishnah, that number one, it goes wherever it's closer to, even if that ends up being a kula. And number two, if it's going to be smack in the middle, it's going to go l'chumra. Where is l'chumra? Each case we spoke about how that's going to be l'chumra. Says the Gemara, Lo yotzrechu deloi bein shkalim lekinim. We did not have to say the case between shkalim and kinim, meaning the Mishnah started off and said between shkalim and nedava. Ask the Gemara, why didn't you just go straight and say between shkalim and kinim? I'm sorry. So let me speak a little bit better. What's the question over here? The question is, there were 13 boxes, and if we go back to the previous Mishnah on Daf Yomi and Aleph, we find something very, very interesting, that basically the shkalim are listed in the very beginning of the Mishnah, and the kinim are listed in the very and the nedavos are listed at the end of the Mishnah. So the Gemara is bothered that we think right now that the boxes were listed in order. So if shkalim's on one end and 13 boxes later is the kinim, why do you assume that you find something between those two boxes? That's a little bit crazy. It should have just said between the shkalim and the kinim, because the kinim are right next door. Again, I might have said that a little backwards. Again, the shkalim and the nedavos were very far away from each other. So why does the Mishnah list that case? The Mishnah lists the case between the shkalim and the kinim, which were closer by. On that answers the Gemara, Ravavon b'shem Rav Pinchas, Kemin buch liyayar. I said that. Sorry. Kemin buch liyayar, that it was like a circle. The boxes were not arranged in a line. And yes, we have a picture. Here it is. Here you see that on the right side, you see number one is your new shkalim, and then it goes all the way in a counterclockwise circle, all the way till you get number 13. Which is going to be the end of your nedavos. Which basically what we're seeing over here is that it is a very strong possibility that the shkalim and the nedavos could be next door to each other. That's why the Gemara lists that picture. Says the Gemara further, Mechsa yipla nedava. So now if it's 50-50, it goes l'nedava. Ask the Gemara, why did the Mishnah should have said a different case? The Mishnah should have said a case that it goes into the shkalim, meaning the Gemara wants to know, why did the Mishnah say that it goes l'nedava? It should go for the shkalim. Answers the Gemara, is the Bayimemar Shem Yiblu L'Shiari Elishcha, is Bayimemar Mechsa Kimi Shemes. Basically, what we're answering over here is what we explained to the Mishnah. We explained to the Mishnah that when it's 50-50, it goes for the Nidava. What's the reason it goes for Nidava? So we spoke out of the Mishnah that the reason being that the Nidava is all for an Oila, whereas the Shkalim sometimes is used for Bedik Habayis. That is exactly what the Gemara is speaking out right now. Again, is the Amri Shema Yibl Lishiyari Alishka? It might be a remnant, it might be an excess shekel. Learned about extensively in the Masechta. What's the story with the excess shkalim? The excess shkalim is used for Bedik Habayis. So we're seeing is that the oila is more important. So the Nedava is more Chomer. That's one answer. The other answer is the Mechza we make a Kmisha mace, which we've seen that if someone dies, what do you do with their Shekalim? It goes to be brought a Chatos. That's the reason why we're going to go and use it as a Nedava and not go and use it for the Shekalim. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yasa ad Ana Taman. Before I got to Eretz Yisrael, Shamas Kol Rav Yehuda Shal Shmuel. I heard Rav Yehuda ask Shmuel, if Shekalim you mace, what happens if you gave your shekel and then you died? It goes as a Nadava. Moiser Asir Seifa, the Asir Seifa being the carbon that the Kohen Gadol would bring every single day. Other Kohanim would bring once the first time they did their Avodah. Asir Seifa Shalai, the excess, the Moiser of the Asir Seifa, what do we do with that? Rav Yechon Amar Yelichem Liyam HaMelech, this should sound familiar. Rav Lezer Amar Yipli Nadava. Says the Gemara, we have a question. The kasha v'yesh chatas kreva oila. We have a problem. The Mishnah discussed at the end of the Mishnah that what happens if we have the kinim next to the goizli oila. So we said if we have a kinim next to the goizli oila, they go for the goizli oila. Why do they go for the goizli oila? Because we said oila is very chomer, obviously, and the kinim we spoke out based on the previous gemaras that the kinim, according to the chachamim at least, part of them go for a chatas, and that's the reason why Chatos is not as chomer as an oila. Ask the Gemara, I don't understand. Very good that you're choosing the more chomer one, but it can't break rules. If it might have been a chatos, how can you go and bring it as an oila? Answers the Gemara, Chizki Achi b'shem Rav Shimon ben Lakish, Tanoi, Bezdin, who ala Moisa Shekrivu Oilais. This sound familiar? We've seen this many blot ago. That it was special tonight that Bezdin made that any time there's an excess, it's going to be an Oila, and therefore we're not worried on the potential possibility that it might have been a Chatos, because this was all built into that original tie tonight. But now the Gemara is bothered. Okay, fine. So now I understand why you're allowed to bring it as an Oila. But ask the Gemara, Hoisha Azois, this woman, but Mahi Mischaperes. She is supposed to bring the kinim. She either was a Zava or she gave birth. But part of her kapara is that the birds are brought as a chatos. But, which we know, a Leda, because she makes different shvuas, she'll never have children again, etc. But says the Gemara, how is she going to get her kapara? If you're using her birds to bring an oila, what happened to her carbon chatos? Amar Rav Yitzchak, Tanai Bezdin, who is special tonight. What's the Tanai? Hamesabeg es akinim, the suppliers, the vendors, the birds of the base Amigdash, who misabig sab soiles. He's going to have to supply in such a scenario. What do you mean he's going to have to supply in such a scenario? That in a case where it's going to become compulsory, like in this case, I should say, because we found the money in between and we're not sure what to do with it, so we're going to go and we're going to bring with it a carbon oila. But now, for this woman, we're going to go and we're going to bring an extra kinim, an extra carbon chatas. How are we going to get an extra carbon chatas? Those who supply the birds are going to have to supply an extra set of birds so that we can bring it specially for her carbon chatas. Finishing up this Mishnah, loy tzurcha, to loy bin ketayres leitzim. It's not, we did not necessarily have to say the case between, we take out the word ketayres, and rather between oila, between bein leitzim lelavayna. We did not have to say bein eitzim lelavayna lizav lechapayres. The Mishnah should not have said anything aside for between the oila and the eitzim, or these are two different cases, either between the oila and the eitzim, or between the lavayna and the zav. Why do we have to say all the other cases? Says the Gemara, the opposite. Why didn't we also say these cases in the Mishnah? The Mishnah didn't list every case. On that answers the Gemara. I'm sure what everyone's assuming. The final clause in the Mishnah that added on that the general rule is, that comes to include even the cases which were not necessarily listed explicitly with our in the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, second Mishnah of this parak. 8 lines at the bottom, Yutesam and Alf. We have money left over in front. This should sound very familiar. We've had this before in Psachim. We have money that's found in front of the animal dealers. If we have money found in Yerushalayim, we assume Laila Meiser. We assume it's Meiser Sheni. Of course, Meiser Sheni is the different tips you have to bring up and eat in Yerushalayim. So a lot of money, which is going to be found, is Meiser Sheni money, because people bring up their money, buy different items, and consume it there. So says the Gemara, money that's found in front of the Seichri Behema, that is going to be Meiser. Baharabayis, but money found on the Harabayis is Chulin, is going to be assumed to be Chulin. Ubi Yerushalayim, then it's different. But then Bishar Kol Yimos Hashana, during the rest of the year, Chulin, it's going to be Chulin. Ubishas HaRegel Kol Meiser. But during Yom Tif, then it's going to be all Meiser. What's the reason that B'Shas HaRegel it's going to be Meiser in Yerushalayim? The reason is because Yerushalayim, we spoke about this back in Psachim, they used to sweep the streets every single day. And therefore, if you found something during Yom Tif, you could assume, when did it come from? It didn't come from right now. It didn't come from the whole year. It came from right now. Therefore, you don't necessarily look at the majority of monies within Yerushalayim the whole year. The majority of money we assume to be Chulin. That's the first point. B'Shari Moshe is Chulin. But on Yom Tif, we assume that it's fresh money because all of the money was swept up. And what money is here? Money that people brought with them to bring to buy karbanos, to buy different items. That's going to be Meiser Sheni. Now we continue. Basar Shenim Seba Azara, we find meat inside the Azara. The Evarim are oilis. The Chatichos are chatos. If it's an Aver Alim, we assume it's carbon oil. If it's a piece of a carbon, it's a chatos. Uber Yerushalayim, if you find the meat outside of the Beis HaMikdash, throughout Yerushalayim, then Zivchei Shlamim, we assume it's a carbon Shlamim. But no one should stop here. Don't assume it's a real carbon. Says the Mishnah, Zev is Zev. But both of these cases are, all three of these cases, I should say, to Ubar, to Ras, Avatz, the basis. You don't actually bring it as a carbon. Rather, you wait for it to lose its shape, and then you burn it. And so everyone's wondering, so if you're just going to let it burn, let it lose its, get deformed, and burn it, why does the Mishnah say that it's an oila, it's a shlamim, it's a chatas? So the Mefarshim here explain, the reason being, because let's say you by accident went and ate the carbon. The halacha is that you were not over me'ilah, because there's no me'ilah by the oila chatas and shlamim. Says the Gemara. Last line of Yutezim and Alf. Nimsa b'gvulin, he found meat outside of Yerushalayim. Evarim nevelos. Now if you found a limb, what's a limb doing on the floor? It must be an avela, must be wasn't a good shchita, and so just threw it out. But chatichos, let's say you found a slice of beef, a slice of meat, mutarais, then you're allowed to eat it. What's the reason? The basic reason being, why would someone, if the animal, if the shechita was no good, they would just discard it? Why would they go and cut a nice slice of meat? Must be that it actually was a good shechita. Says the Mishnah, as we turn over to Yutasim Beis, B'Shas HaRegel during Yom Tif, Shabbos Meruba, that Afivar Mutarais. When there's a lot of meat around that during Yom Tif, then we can even assume that if you found a limb, that it's going to be mutter. Says the Gemara, we the Mishnah did not have to say, all the Mishnah should have said, that anything which is found on the Harabayis is going to be Kodesh. Why does the Mishnah say that everything is going to be Chulin? Seems to be a contradiction. Items on Harabayis, we should assume that it's a carbon. Answers the Gemara, Rabbi Ba, Rav Chia b'Shem Rav Yechon Chazaka Shenakayin Moitzim in Alishka Mois Ashu Mechulalin Al Behema. Now we understand that why were all the items on the Harabayis, any money that's found there, we assume to be Chulin, because all the money that was brought to the Beis HaMikdash, all those machzeh, shekels, etc., the Kohanim had brought karbanos. So we assume that they bought the karbanos right away, and there was never a potential that the money could have fallen while it had kedusha, because right away the kedusha went off and went on to the carbon, and that's the reason why anything on the Harabayis is going to be Chulin. Basar Shenim. So then we continue in the Mishnah. And the Mishnah said, if you find the meat in the Beis HaMikdash itself, so then the Evarim are oilos, and the pieces are chatais, and in Yerushalayim it's all shlamim, but don't worry, everything has to be burnt. Says the Gemara 5 lines down, Yutazim and Beis, he brought a raya that we see that as Iber Tura has to lose its appearance. I'll just point out a big machlekes we show. What does it mean lose its appearance? Does it mean that it has to be left overnight? Then as the nicer and automatically it's called Uber Tura. Does it mean you have to just let it spoil even if it's not overnight? That's called Uber Tura. Maybe different pshat what Uber Tura means. Amar Rav Aisha Masnit and Amar Kain are Mishnah's raya. What did the Mishnah say? Two Uber Tura. So if you and then you burn it. You can't eat this meat. Why not? Maybe it lost its surah and it's not a kosher carbon. That's the reason why you're going to have to burn it. Nimsa B'Gvulin, we continue the Mishnah. Let's say you find it outside of Yerushalayim. Then we said that the pieces, the limbs, the Ivarim are Nevelos. Why else is that on the floor? But the slices, we said, are going to be mutter. Why are the slices mutter? Because why else did someone slice the meat if not for the fact that the Shechita was Ksheira, Rav Crispa, B'Shem, Rav Yosi, Rav Chanina, Ivarim, Nevelos. Like in Alei Misham Nevela. The Ivarim, the limbs are Nevela, and if you eat it, it's really Nevela. You get Malchus. Masni Tamar came. The Mishnah Gemara says, alright, Mishnah Zaraya. What do the Mishnah say? Ivarim Nevelas, the Chatichas Mutarais. So we bring a Raya. The Chatichas Mutarais. What did the Mishnah mean when it said that the slices are mutter? Loi Mamish. It meant Mamish. It wouldn't say mutter. It's not really mutter. It's really mutter. You can eat it. With Kavasa, Ivarim Nevelos, like in the same thing, it's really a Nevela, Leim Misham, Nevela. Din number 1 learned out of the Mishnah. And now this Rav Crispa continues. Rav Crispa, B'Shem Rav Yesi, Rav Chanina continues and says, let's say you're outside Yerushalayim and you find limbs, but they're all strung together. If they're strung together, says Rav Crispa, why did someone string together? Must be that it was a good shechita, therefore we can assume that it's kosher. We continue on this theme of finding meat, famous Gemara. 9 stores sell bad meat, not kosher, and you're not sure which one you bought. What's the halacha? You have to be chaysh that it came from the basar nevela. Why do you have to be chaysh it came from the basar nevela? Well, actually, we'll explain in 1 minute. So you have to be chayshish that it came from the basar nevela. If you found meat in then you go after the roof. So again, if 9 stores are selling not good meat, 1 store is selling good meat, then you mix them up, you don't know which store you bought from, then we have to be worried that you might have bought the nevela, and therefore it's going to be puzzle. The reason being, because if you bought it, that's called kavua. The meat came from within the store. Called kavua, we know the rule is kamechsa mechsa dami, and therefore it's a din deraisa, you have to be machmir. But let's say you found the meat, then you can be holchaz achar aroiv, then you're allowed to go by the roiv, which we're about to see in a moment, the flip side case, which in this case would be treifa, but in the case of kosher stores, will end up being kosher, as the Gemara now explains. And you're not sure which one you bought from, you still have to be worried. Even though there are 9 stores selling good meat, and you bought meat from one of them, you're not sure which one, can't eat it. Why not? We just explained. Kol kavua kemechsa mechsa dami. It was kavua. I was in the store. You bought it. You don't know which one. You got to be chayshish mechsa mechsa. If it's 50-50, it's over. Paulinim says, if you found it, then you go by the roiv. Why do you go by the roiv? Because when you found it, then that's called you're allowed to go by roiv. That's not called mechsa kavua. Therefore, you go regular rules of roiv. In this case, roiv is going to be kosher. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yechanan, Hanim says bi'an nachri, Kinim says b'pelatia. Says the Gemara, and this is going to be the din that we're going to finish off with a story about. The Rav Yechanan said, if you see a guy holding something, it's as if you found it in the street. What does that mean? It's if you found it in the street. Now it's going to depend on the street. If that street was like the second case, that 9 stores sold kosher meat, it's going to be kosher. If that street and 9 stores selling pasul meat, then you're going to go by roiv. Again, so food in the hand of a guy, says Rav Yechanan, is the same thing as finding it on the street. Before we continue and bring a story, let's just get this din very, very clear. It's a simple din. We've seen it many times. Let's just review it for 1 moment. If you find something in the street, then you just go by rive. Got to look around. What's the rive? What's the majority? Majority kosher, treif. But if you bought it from a store and you're not sure which store you bought it from, the rules change. Why do the rules change? Because that's not called a regular suffix that we go by rive. That's called kavua. It was in the store. You bought it from somewhere. Called kavua kemechsa mechsadami. Once it's kavua, once it's in the store, it's 50-50. If it's 50-50, then the halacha is that in all cases, you're going to have to be machmir. Says the Gemara, let's finish up with some stories. Rav Lezer bir Rav Chagai avimasmech l'Rav Mana. He's supporting Rav Mana. Chama lechara rumoi makti min susei. They saw a guy chopping off a piece of his horse, umbapik lebra, and carrying it outside. Okay, Amar Lei. So he says. So this is Rav. Who's this? Rav Lezer and Rav Mana. So one says to the other, Hadayid Amar Rav Yechlan Zazbi Anachi Kinim says Platia. We just saw the guy slice a piece of horse, carry it into the street. Are you now going to tell me that him holding this piece of meat is as if we found it on the floor, and therefore, if it's going to be rive stores are going to be kosher, we're going to be allowed to assume that the meat is kosher? Amar Lei Kain. Yeah, of course. Rav Yosi Rav Yasi, Rabbi Vehensha Roy Yosai, Yosei Miklutin Shal Yisrael, as long as you saw him going out of a Jewish meat market, meaning so the case obviously wasn't that they actually saw him cutting the piece of horse, because if he actually saw him cutting the piece of horse and that exact piece of horse, but basically the point of the story is he cut a piece of horse, and now you're going to see this guy walking from a Jewish meat market. So let's say we're sitting on this street, see him cut a horse, we see him 5 minutes later walking out stores all over the place selling kosher meat. We're going to say, boom, it's as if it's found in the street. What's Allah if it's found in the street? Roiv. What does Roiv say? We're allowed to eat the meat because Roiv stores in this place are kosher. One more story. Chad Bar Nosh. There was a certain person, B'tziborin, Azal by Mizbin Kupen Min Tabcha. He went to buy some beef from the butcher. And the butcher didn't want to give it to him. So this person went to a Roman, and he told the Roman to go buy for him, and he bought for him. He went back to the store owner and he said, I bought a bal karche. You didn't want to sell me the food, and I had someone buy it for you. You had the Roman come in and buy it. I sold him not kosher meat. Rav Yirmiyah b'shem Rav Chanina says the Gemara. Rav Yirmiyah b'shem Rav Chanina explained in this story, Rabbi v'amar lo kula mine meisar mikulan dizipoirin. He's not able to make everything aser. Meaning, what happened over here? There's someone standing here. I go to a store. He doesn't want to sell me meat. So I say, okay, I find my local guy. I say, can you go in and buy some meat? He goes in and buys some meat. I get my meat. I'm very happy. I go back to the store owner. I say, look at that. I got the meat. You don't want to sell it to me. Store owner says, Shkoyach, you got the meat. You know what I sold him? Treif. Says the Gemara, true. That piece of meat is going to be treif. Why is that piece of meat going to be treif? Because he said it's treif. However, are we going to assume now that everything here is treif? No. It's not going to break the rules. It's going to be the same rules. That meat found in the hand of a guy, we're going to go by Roif. And if Roif stores a kosher, it's going to be kosher. We'll pick it up from here tomorrow.